sugar estates in Barbados? Because I know a lot of the Barbadians worked as sugar boilers on most of the estates. So were there sugar estates in Barbados?
Yeah, there were many. There were many sugar estates, and I think that there are many Guyanese who were what we call the sugar boilers, working at these estates, these factories really. Right now, there's only one factory, but in the 60s, there could be as many as 12, 13 factories. And I know there are many, as I said, many Guyanese who were actually in charge of, they call it sugar boilers.
Yeah, but in Guyana, a lot of the sugar boilers were from Barbados. So it was like...
So it was just like a transfer?
Yeah, it was like a transfer. Because that's what I was reading. So I thought that maybe it was a skill that they taught in Barbados and then sent the Barbadians out to the different...
Maybe, but I know there were many Guyanese. I know Guyanese very last year. Hazel, Sergeant Hazel. And there were Guyanese, there were two brothers. And then there was a Fingal to the... He was another Guyanese that lived in Barbados.
Okay.
My name is Son Dianansi, and I am a Guyanese, which also makes me a West Indian, and which also makes me a descendant of someone from a faraway land. And who exactly were our ancestors? Where did they live? What did they look like? What were their customs? In short, who are we? In this series of podcasts, we will meet and chat with people from Guyanese and other West Indian communities who've been asking these and other related questions. Who was that great-great-great-grandmother and that great-great-great-grandfather? As some folks like to say, if you don't know where you're from, then how are you going to know where you're going? Some months ago, I discovered a site with the headline, Van Cooten Voices. On the homepage it reads, the aim of this site is to make available Van Cooten family history information, provide a means of collaboration between extended family members, and to make available several sources for researchers of families with British Guyana connections. So who were the Van Cootens? I asked myself this question after noting that they had compiled an extensive list of the colonists of British Guyana. If you are a Guyanese with European ancestry and you follow this list, you might well encounter the beginnings of your European lineage. In episode 4 of our series on the West Indian family tree, we will meet Rod Van Cooten, the creator of Van Cooten Voices and a descendant of Dutch colonists. Also, our conversation with writer and educator Jacqueline Smartt continues with a focus on her Barbadian roots. In this, we will be joined by Lennox Price, former Barbados Consul-General in New York. let's start from the beginning. Who is Rod Van Cooten?
Who am I? I am. I suppose I'm an Australian, I would have to say. I'm a father. I'm an IT person originally. I like doing family history research. I sing in a choir.
Okay, interesting.
And I'm a person of faith as well. So
Okay.
I'm connected to church here in Australia.
Right. How did this entire process get started for you in terms of, going into your own family's history?
So my surname is Van Cooten, which is a Dutch name.
Right.
And in Australia, that's not terribly common. So you'd always get asked as a child, where does that name come from? Are you Dutch? And I say, well, not really, or not for a long time. And so I discovered my aunt passed on to my father some letters that had been written by my great-grandfather, who was the one who came to Australia, writing back to his half-sister and father in England saying, where did the family come from? Tell me more, because he came out to Australia when he was 18. He had a lot of prospects in England at the time, and this was about 1875. And so they told him some of the stories, which there were several generations in England. So they told these stories of sort of plantation ownership, and my forebear Hendrik was a map maker and surveyor. And there was this place called Bride's Lust that they talked about, which we didn't know where that was, and it turns out that that's Bride's Lust, the area just near Georgetown.
Right. That's interesting. Let's go back a little bit. Who you say was actually talking about Bride's Lust?
So in these letters from my great-grandfather's half-sister talking to my great-grandfather, she's talking about these plantations that the family owned at one stage and then lost. And so but she called it Bride's Lust. So obviously she had never, as in sort of a husband-wife, bride, Bride's Lust. She'd never heard, obviously, what the real pronunciation was, or had ever seen it spelled. So I think she also talked about a plantation called Sheet Anchor, and what was the other one? Better Hope, I think, was
interesting.
So they were,
and all of these plantations were owned by the Van Cooten family.
They were, apparently.
Okay.
So, but back then, so we're talking about the 1970s. It was very hard to do any research, particularly from Australia and Guyana at that time, and so on. So eventually, the thing so I still researched the family history and tried to connect the family to Holland, or it was very, very difficult. But eventually, I worked at the University of Melbourne, and at one point I was working at an IT job in the library for a couple of years, and I came across Crowns of Glory, Tears of Blood, the Amelia Viotta da Costa book, and that talked about the 1823 rebellion. And in that, my forebear was named along with the plantations, and told the story and pointed to a whole heap of resources available in the UK archives and in various places that sort of opened up a whole new world.
Okay.
Hi, so today I'm here with Mr. Lennox Price. Thank you so much for coming, who was the former Consul-General for Barbados. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Barbadian side of my family. So my great-grandfather was born in Barbados, and we had no idea what his birth certificate was or where it was or whatever else. So my great-uncle Joseph, over here, Francis Joseph, he and I traveled to Barbados to do a little bit of history. So when we traveled there, well, first of all, the name. His name was Francis Kenyon, is what they knew him in Guyana as Francis Kenyon Smartt. And I kept seeing the name Nathaniel show up. And I kept saying to my Uncle Joseph, was there a third brother? Because I knew there was Uncle Damon and there was his dad. And he said, no, it was just the two of them. But Nathaniel was in some documents. So I go to the archives in Barbados and Francis Nathaniel Smartt. Because, people get nicknames, and the nicknames become a part of their names, and it's not really theirs. And I discovered that he was from this area in Barbados called the Glebes. My great-great-grandfather, who was from the Glebe, he was also, I guess we would call it, an artisan too.
Yeah, a carpenter, definitely a carpenter. That was all in that category.
Right, so he was a laborer, a carpenter, and then a farmer. And one of the things was he left Barbados to go to Guyana to work on the sugar estate. And he worked, they were paying, I think, 30 cents a day or something like that back then, because he was born in 1870, and I'm guessing he got married to my great-grandmother in 1907. So I'm guessing he was a young guy, and I think they did have a child before yet. My great-aunt was born in 1905, and my grandfather was born in 1907. And I know they got married in April, so I'm guessing my grandfather was in Melbourne. And he was working on the estate until one of the supervisors of the sugar estate thought it would be a good idea to sort of tell him that he was lending him out to another sugar estate, and he did not want to be treated like chattel. So he cussed the man out, told him off and what he could do with his 30 cents a day. And he went into business for himself. So he had cows and sheep and goats and chickens, and his wife had a little kitchen garden, and they had rice fields. And he just basically developed his own stuff. So then he taught his children. So my grandfather was the oldest boy. I don't know if they did this in Barbados. The oldest boy had to go live with the grandmother.
Not to my knowledge. Yeah. Well, but because not to my knowledge, but I do know that a lot of children they live with the grandmother. I would say more so the girls.
Yeah.
The girls more so live at their parents. Yeah.
Okay.
The producers of this podcast resided in Barbados for an extended period. This was around the time of the 2008 economic meltdown. Peter Ram, of Woman by My Side fame, was at the height of his popularity. And so was dancehall artist Crime Son, the Bajan, who expressed pride in his Bajan twang. The Bajan experience was in many ways quite unlike our native Guyanese experience. And yet, we felt quite at home in BIM. But then again, maybe we were at home.
Then, if you're interested in doing your family's history, what are the names of your parents and then your names of your grandparents to see how far back you remember?
Okay, no different than see Prices.
Your mother's parents.
Yeah, okay, on my mother's side, I know it's Price. Bell, Nablet, I think Hinkson. Yeah, pretty much that's from.
And the great grandparents?
Right, the great grandparents side, on my mother's side, great grandparents side, Nablet and Bell.
Oh, okay. All right.
And on my that's her. That's on her mother's side. See, that then on
your father's
on
side?
grandfather's side, it'd be say that Price, Hickson, I think Head.
Which one?
Head, H-A-Y-D-E.
Oh, okay. Oh, I've heard that name before.
For our conversation with Rod Van Cooten, we were joined by Morty Lindie, one of the main respondents in this series, and Jaime Pablo, the host and producer of Pablo's Creole's Corner.
To Rod and Morty and Andy, thanks for having me on the show. Rod, like most of us are, your fascination and curiosity, I should say, is a better word, in your identity is probably what drives this this desire to really explore, and I find it the same. In fact, Morty had mentioned genie.com on the last podcast, and I went there and started my my family tree, my immediate family tree, and I connected with a half sister. Fascinating. I mean, and Morty, you mentioned that it was kind of a compulsive thing after a while, like you just can't get off of it. I had planned to just spend about maybe 10 minutes, and I've spent about 2 hours. Okay. But yeah, so I must applaud you, Rod, for your commitment to really pursuing your ancestry. My question to you, Rod, is first, as we all know, there were lots of things going on back in the day, in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. It was a different world, a lot of invasions and conquests and exploitation and so on and so forth, including intermingling. Let's put it that way. So there are Van Coutens. I have friends who are Van Coutens in Guyana.
Right.
Yes. So of course they look like me, right? So I'm curious as to when and if you do visit Guyana, and in your research, have you come across Van Coutens who look like me?
I have.
Okay.
So I've, again, not been to Guyana, but there's a family of Van Coutens in Canada, Michael Van Cooten, who was editor of the Pride newspaper. I was in touch with him and his family. Some time ago, I established contact with them and tried to work out sort of where they connected. And we still haven't quite worked it out, but so I know a fair bit of information back from the 1820s and very little sort of modern day connection. So there's sort of two ends from back then and from now, trying to join together, and so it's hard to know how people connect. I'd love to find out more about the modern day Van Coutens and how and where they connect.
Indeed, yeah.
The question of how should we reconcile with the past is one that we will continually confront over the course of this series, and it was one that Pablo asked of Van Cooten.
And now I'm curious about, for me, it's been fascinating exploring, and I've done some poetry on this, the Christian contradiction. When we look at the history of slavery and colonialism and so on, how do you, as a Caucasian descendant, I'm presuming, of folks who were involved in that activity, how do you, in the modern day, reconcile those that were considered okay back then, but from now, looking at it from the prism of today, is considered like real atrocities? How do you reconcile that as a Christian? Yeah.
I struggle.
Okay.
I think there is an incredible amount of injustice, and it's wrong.
Yeah.
And so I think European civilization has a lot to answer for, and Christianity has a lot to redress. In many ways. I struggle. I like to think that ultimately it's sort of arising from Christianity, that some of this started to be unpicked and undone. It's interesting to sort of consider what part my forebears played in that.
Right.
Hendrik apparently had a reputation for being more benign and more friendly to the people on the plantation and so on than many of the others. He encouraged a chapel to be built on his plantation or Le Souvenir, the adjacent plantations. So there was sort of the start of the movement to emancipation and so on. But I think if I was there in person at that time, I'd find it incredibly challenging and difficult to see what was going on.
Absolutely. And finally, personally, I feel that there is good in the world, that it's not confined to any one race or the other, right? And I feel that when good people get together, regardless of their ethnicities or ideologies, etc., that good things can happen in the world. How do you feel about the role of people like you who were descendants of the folks who were on the other side of the equation as far as slavery and colonialism are concerned? What is the role of the good people, right, in terms of reconciling the past? Because there's still, as Andy mentioned, I've done extensive work on reparations and the injustice. You mentioned the word the injustice of it all.
Yeah.
What do you think? What is your role, and what do you think the role of folks who are descendants of folks who were former plantation owners and so on and so forth, slave owners? What should their role be in this era?
I think because we know more, I think some of us have done more research and know more, we have a responsibility to sort of set some of that example. Some are more in a position financially to sort of try and assist, but that's one of the things I've been sort of thinking about. What can I do?
Yes.
In a small way, and so one of the ideas I've had is actually naming the people who were enslaved people. I mean, many of them are invisible, and their names have disappeared, and yet their names are there, and they show up in many different resources as names, and they don't have a family name, so it's very difficult to actually connect them together. But they are linked to plantations in some cases. They are linked to each other as families, and I think I'm sort of trying to explore some of the ways of maybe collecting some of those and putting them together and helping people who want to sort of connect themselves to those times to actually name and acknowledge these people who experienced a lot of this injustice.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm curious initially whether all of your research was done purely from an online perspective where you were able to access these many databases and sources that you mentioned, or did you have to do any extensive traveling to help solidify some of the information that you saw or confirm some of the information that you saw?
I've not been to Guyana, unfortunately. It's something I would love to do at some point. Some of the research, some of the archives information I found was actually on microfilm and microfiche. So there's a number of companies have taken the Church Missionary Society archives, which hold a lot of information about the 1823 rebellion, and also the mission that was based in what was now Georgetown. All those records are actually there, so you can find information there. Some of the old newspapers, the Gazette and so on, some copies of that are there. there's original correspondence by some of the players at that time, including my forebear Hendrik. So he was sympathetic to the missionary cause, and he had contacts in England, and he'd been asked to sort of provide some understanding of what the conditions were like in a colony back to the Church Missionary Society in London. So I was able to see some of their records there. I also discovered that Hendrik was a map maker and surveyor, so I've been to the Netherlands. I've been to the archives there and actually seen and held some of his original hand-drawn maps, which has been absolutely amazing. And also some records in the UK Public Records Office, but much of the information has been online from various people. I think I've mentioned Tiquis, the person who maintains the Guyana Colonial Colonists Index. That information has been gleaned from all sorts of different places, and I've made that information available online on her behalf.
Well, we've arrived at another rest stop. Thanks again for joining us. Thanks for your shares and comments. And please do continue to spread the word. Next up, we'll take a deeper dive into Morty's Kokwani hometown and share more of our conversations with Jacqueline Smartt and Rod Van Cooten.
Of a root, or the mark of a leaf, or the shape of a flower.
It was me, always walking with bare feet, meeting strange faces like those in dreams or fever. When the whole world turns upside down, and no one knows which is the sky or the land. Which heart is his among the torn or wounded? Which face is his among the strange and terrible? Walking about, groaning between the wind.